Hi friends, and thanks so much for accessing this online tutorial for the school-wide PBIS Tiered Fidelity Inventory, or what we're going to refer to from now on pretty much as the TFI. My name is Trish Diebold, and I am the MTSS PBIS Data Coach for the Special School District PBIS team, and I'll be walking you through the tutorial today. So by the end of this online session, you will be able to administer the Tiered Fidelity Inventory with your school team. You'll be able to facilitate conversations and ask stretch questions to promote thinking, and you'll also be able to access resources for this year's PBIS evaluation season. First, we'll go through an overview of the TFI, and we'll make connections to what we already know and do. Next, we'll talk about how school teams can prepare for and administer the TFI as a team-based process. And then finally, we'll talk about some specific items at each of the three subscales for tiers 1, 2, and 3. So we can go ahead and get started with an overview. The TFI fits very nicely with the comprehensive integrated three-tiered model that we've adopted here in St. Louis County, thanks to the work of Drs. Lane, Kahlberg, and Menzies. This CI3 team model looks at three different domains, the academic, behavioral, and social, all within one multi-tiered framework. And the TFI tends to do the same. You're looking at a lot of specific behavioral and social pieces that really build systems within all three tiers. So you're really evaluating all three tiers at once. And the TFI is nice. There are some academic pieces that are also built in, so you do get to touch on all three of the domains, looking at all three tiers. Really, the purpose of the TFI is to provide school teams with data so that they can continue to make improvements to what they implement as far as PBIS and a comprehensive model within their building. You'll get data on all three tiers. So there's a subscale that looks at your universal PBIS, a subscale that looks at tier 2 and your targeted small group prevention and intervention, and then the tier 3 intensive subscale that looks at the supports that you provide for students who need that individualized and intensive support. The TFI was created to be that one-stop shop for evaluation needs, and so designers incorporated all of the key components from other assessments, like the team implementation checklist, the benchmarks of quality, benchmarks for advanced tiers, the SAS. All key components from each of those are included within the TFI, and so while you can continue to use the other assessments, it's not really necessary. That TFI is really intended to be a one tool that will help you to evaluate all of your tiers efficiently and effectively. Missouri still requires completion of the self-assessment survey, or the SAS, as part of their criteria for becoming an active or staying an active PBIS school. And so that will remain part of our assessment schedule as well, just to let you know. But otherwise, we are no longer facilitating benchmarks of quality or BAT. And again, if those are something that you would like to do, just let your district facilitator know and we can open those up for you. The TFI is a self-assessment. It is team-based, and so your PBIS team or leadership team will sit down together to have conversations around each of the items in the TFI, and we'll look at data and products in order to make decisions. While the primary audience is the team, you will want to think about how you're going to share your data with faculty, families, administrators, other stakeholders within the school, so they are kept up to date on how things are rolling and that they feel like they have a voice in what you do. One of the cool features of the TFI is that it can be used multiple times throughout the year for progress monitoring and action planning. And so we are going to encourage that teams take advantage of this opportunity, and around 3 times a year, kind of in alignment with behavioral screening, it might be a good idea to sit down with your team and conduct the TFI. At this point for the annual evaluation, we are looking at all three tiers, and so school teams will implement the TFI, answering items for each of the subscales. But For progress monitoring purposes, if you think it would be beneficial just to look at one tier over another, that is absolutely okay. So the TFI can be used in multiple ways. We've talked about quite a few of them. It can be a formative assessment that is used for planning prior to implementing a PBIS or a multi-tiered framework within a school. We talked a little bit about progress monitoring and action planning multiple times throughout the year. The recommended time is 3 times per year, and that could align nicely with an assessment schedule that you have that includes behavioral screening or academic screening. It can be used at that end of the year annual self-assessment, as it is right now, and it could also be used for state recognition. Missouri does recognize the TFI as an assessment that aligns to the criteria that they have for their award. Once you complete the TFI and enter one completed set of items into PBIS apps, you will be able to access your data pretty much immediately, and you'll be able to see it in different ways. So every school will be able to see what their total score was, their subscale scores for each of the tiers, subscale scores looking at different subcategories within each of the tiers around data, systems, and practices, and then individual items. So you will be able to delve down very deep into the TFI and really pull out specific items for action planning. Current research shows that the criteria score for Tier 1 is really around 70%. So that 70% marker is where teams can feel confident that they are implementing Tier 1 effectively and efficiently. There are not yet recommendations for Tier 2 and Tier 3 subscales, but that will provide teams with good information around what key pieces they are implementing and what they might want to build on for the future. This is a look at what a subscale report might look like. So you'll see it's broken down into the 3 different tiers, and within the tiers you'll see words like teams, implementation, and evaluation. Really the data, systems, and practices that are mentioned over and over again within PBIS and other multi-tiered systems of supports. If you've completed the TFI previously, you'll also be able to look at data over time. So you'll have different bars that will show what your score has been within each of the subscales during previous and current implementation of the tiered fidelity inventory. Next, we can talk a little bit about how to prepare for and administer the TFI with your team. And we will do this in 3 different pieces. We'll talk a little bit about what you can do before to prepare, what you could do during to make the TFI conversations and item completion run smoothly, and then what you might want to do after to make sure that you have data that's usable for decision making. We'll start with the before, and in preparing for TFI, it might be important to create a schedule for your self-assessment. It is recommended by the TFI creators that you usually set aside around 15 to 20 minutes per tier if you've done the TFI before. If you have not, usually around 20 to 30 minutes per tier is sufficient. And please know that it does not need to be completed in one meeting. You want to make sure that you invite the right people to the table. Especially important are administrators who can make those leadership decisions. You might also want to consider behavioral experts, data analysts, and other team members. While it's not necessary to have all team members at the table, we are going to encourage that you have as many as possible while still making it an efficient conversation. And it's especially important to have membership from all 3 tiers, experts from all 3 tiers who kind of know what's going on within each of those tiers so that they can provide that critical information and communication to other team members. The TFI does look at products and documentation to support the decision making and the self-rating, and so you'll want to start collecting products and documentation to have ready for the conversation. And then there are 3 prep pieces, 1 piece for each tier within the TFI, and you'll want to have those conducted or completed before. The walkthrough is the Tier 1 prep piece. That does not take much time, but it does require a little bit of prep. Then the Tier 2 piece is a targeted intervention reference guide map. It's not a mandatory piece, but it is a nice visual, and it is something that not everyone needs to complete. It might just be completed by Tier 2, Tier 3 team members who have some idea of what's going on with those interventions, and that data can be brought back to the table. And then finally there's the Tier 3 support plan worksheet. And again, not everyone has to complete that. It might just be those involved in the creation and the implementation of those Tier 3 support plans on the Tier 3 team. However, those do directly tie to items in the TFI, and so you will want to make sure that that is completed and brought to the conversation around the Tier 3 subscale. The TFI recommends having specific pieces of documentation. However, if you have received training from special school districts, PBIS team in the past, some of the language might not look as familiar, and so we've kind of aligned what is recommended from the TFI with what the documentation may look or sound like if you've been to some of SSD's trainings. So we would recommend that you bring along a team contact sheet with roles and responsibilities for Tier 1, maybe a district or school handbook, your Tier 1 meeting minutes, a handbook for students and parents, your multi-tiered action plan, past evaluation reports, maybe your Big 5 data and your triangle data, any screening data that you might have. This is going to differ by district, and that's okay. Not every product needs to be at the table, and in fact, if you notice during your conversations that you don't have a piece and that you'd like to have a piece, this would be a great place to start action planning. At Tier 2, your documentation might look like Tier 2-3 meeting minutes, problem-solving minutes, student identification charts, intervention guidelines, an implementation manual with documented processes, any intervention data that you might have, any documented systems and practices for communicating with families, and then again, any past evaluation reports. Finally, at Tier 3, your documentation may include Tier 3 systems team meeting minutes or Tier 3 practice team meeting minutes, any Tier 3 intervention guidelines you have, 3 separate individualized support plans, which might include your functional assessment-based intervention data, RAP data, renew data, and the plans that correspond with that data. And then any numbers that you have for around students who are in interventions and are responding positively. Now that we've prepared for, we'll talk a little bit about during the administration of the self-assessment. Again, it is a team process, so you'll want to have as many key players at the table as possible, especially administration. You want to use a systematic process for database decision making so that you can be sure that the decisions that are made and the ratings that are made are based on data and have equal voice. Roles and responsibilities might be beneficial so that a timekeeper, say, can make sure that you're staying within the time constraints that you might have. It's going to be important to create a safe to say environment and ensure equal voice because, again, it is a team process and you want to make sure that the people who are participating in this conversation feel like they have had a valued voice in the decision and the ratings that will result. We are going to highly recommend to complete a paper copy of this because we all know how well technology can work all the time. It's especially important if you're administering this over multiple meetings, and so if you have a paper copy and you can circle the rating scores on that paper copy, take notes maybe on the paper copy, you'll have 1, a backup, and then 2, additional notes that might help with action planning once you have your data graphed through PBIS apps. After administration, the team will enter 1 submission for the TFI on pbisapps.org. You'll be able to access your data, as we mentioned, pretty much immediately. And then you'll work with your team at some point to select at least one item to use for action planning past that.